Yes. So once again, thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be here. The title of this talk is Ad honestae eruditionis cupidinem, or reading the Attic Nights in the 21st century. We all know more or less how the Attic Nights used to be read in the previous centuries. I just, in order to remember and to show everybody the most recent perspectives, I chose four authors. The first one is, this is Collegium Gallianum. You are all welcome to join it. The first author is Amiel Vardi, 2004. This is the classic chapter in the collection of essays on Gellius, published by Vardi together with Professor Holford Strevens. And it deals with the genre and the conventions and the cultural program in Aulus Gellius. And he pays attention to four main points. So this all has been already said in our conference today and yesterday. These topics have been mentioned. So if we look at the collection, which is the Attic Nights, we see that there is knowledge, doctrina or historia, as Gellius himself calls it, so the content of the book. Then there is the aspect of accumulation, collecting things, the author's effort in finding the appropriate content. Then there is choice, so the author decides about what to include in his book and what not to include. And isolation, so the author's art of arranging the content in digestible particles, especially for Gellius. This is very nice to read because the chapters are very brief. Some of them are longer, but here we can also see the authorial effort in isolating particular topics into chapters. More or less at the same time, several months later, there was a paper by a Polish researcher, Krystyna Bartol, and she studied, the paper is in Italian, Per una morfologia della poikilografia antica. And she studied several authors whom she decided to group under the name poikilography. The term is, of course, known, has been known earlier, and it appears in ancient authors as well. But she somehow tried to recycle this term and to give it, she proposed it as the name of the genre. And her approach is different, but she comes to similar conclusions. So first, in these books like Gellius, we have a variety of content, varietas. Gellius himself speaks about it in his preface, or disparilitas, you can also say. Then a compilatory character. The author accumulates references to earlier works, and this is programmatic, and it underscores the third element, artistic unity. So how the author combines these sources and how he makes use of these sources. And then the third element is the artistic unity or the internal coherence on the textual level. So the author's literary input lies in creating a new aesthetically oriented text based on old material. So this all has been known, and this is the first decade of the 21st century. In the second decade of the 21st century, we had some new approaches, and a very well-known book by William Johnson, Readers and Reading Culture in the High Roman Empire. And the book has a subtitle, A Study of Elite Communities. And I think this subtitle is very important because Johnson pays attention to how, while we're reading the book, how we can see the interactions within the elite community. And he speaks also of the gatekeeping function. So the book, or whatever is described, the interactions described in the book, can teach us can teach the reader how to enter higher levels of the intellectual society. So this is a very new perspective, very modern. And this was also continued by Joseph Howley in his book in 2018. And he says intellectual biography, he looks at these, especially at these chapters where Gellius speaks about his own life or presents the material as if it were the events in his own life. Intellectual biography thus reported both models and engages the reader in the project of self-scrutiny. That is an essential part of the Attic Nights unifying project for its reader. And this is something that inspires me greatly, that the book can engage the reader in the project of self-scrutiny. And Gellius, this was always my impression when I first started to read the Attic Nights, that Gellius wants to play with us. He asks us questions. For example, he was often criticized by previous readers, scholars from previous generations, that he leaves certain questions unanswered, he repeats himself, he's so chaotic and so on. But we can see, of course, it doesn't mean that he never makes any mistakes, he does. But very often these unanswered questions and these repetitions are ways for the author to engage the reader in the literary interplay. And keeping all that in mind, I would like to show you, well, we all know this because we are in the academia and we are in education. There is this framework that is called the KSA model, which stands for knowledge, skills, and abilities, sometimes also attitudes instead of abilities or habits. And I would like to show you this passage from the preface of Gellius, where I think that he matches very well this modern KSA model that we are all very familiar with. So Gellius says, why is he even writing this book or publishing his collection? He says that he did it in his free time. He was a busy man, so he took his free time to furari otium in negotiorum intervalla in quibus furari otium potui, exercitus defessusque sum, it was tiring, modica ex his eaque sola accepi, que aut ingenia prompta expeditaque ad honeste eruditionis cupidinem, utiliumque artium contemplationem celeri facilique compendio ducerent, aut homines alis iam vitae negotis occupatos, a turpi certe agrestique rerum atque verborum imperitia vindicarent. And I would like to focus here on this honeste eruditionis cupidinem, which was already announced in the title of this talk. Ingenia prompta expeditaque, so he expects something already from his readers, but he doesn't expect much previous knowledge, I think. Well, maybe basic erudition, but the most important thing for him is ingenium promptum expeditumque. So if I want to learn, I can use this book to learn more. And then ad honeste eruditionis cupidinem ducerent. My books, my collection, my Attic Nights will lead such people now towards what? Towards the eruditio, towards the artes, not directly, because he says ducerent ad cupidinem eruditionis honeste, ad contemplationem artium utilium. So for me, when I read this, for me, honesta eruditio is knowledge, artes or contemplatio artium skills, but then he wants to lead us towards the cupido. He wants to create within us cupido, so the wish for learning, the will for learning. And this cupido, I think, matches very well these attitudes or habits, or maybe abilities, but attitudes and habits seem to describe it better. So I compare this with my own classes, with my students. I try to teach them some elements of knowledge. I try to train them in certain skills, like translating from Latin into other languages, etc. But for me also, the most important thing is to inspire them and to show them that this class is not that important. This lecture is not that important. The most important thing is that you want to learn more later, that you are yourself inspired to study and to investigate. So I think that Gellius shares this attitude as well. He wants to he says it, he wants to ducere ingenia prompta ad cupidinem eruditionis. So the fact that I want to gain knowledge is much more important than the very fact that I am gaining knowledge. And then, of course, another aspect is that he promises us that he will do it celeri facilique compendio. So this rings a bell when you have these modern self-study books or this series for dummies. Somehow, I don't want to say that Gellius' The Attic Nights is literature for dummies, but somehow it rings a bell when I hear celeri facilique compendio. And then there is also another aspect, another goal, not only ingenia prompta, people who are ready to commit themselves to literature, to literary studies, but also people who they are already busy with other careers and they want to continue their education in a less formal manner. Alice vite negotis occupatos, a turpi certe agrestic vererum atque verborum imperitia vindicare. He wants to save them from the lack of knowledge, rerum atque verborum. So this is his promise, and as we see the KSA model, I hope this is convincing. Of course, I don't want to be very orthodox about this, but it's just an association that I had. And the ultimate source of knowledge for us today, the Wikipedia says that, well, this is quite obvious, we all know it, the subject knowledge, the subjects, topics, and items. Now, I want to read it to you, or I want you to read this with me, while thinking about the Attic Nights of Gellius, to see how it matches what we read in this ancient text. So we have knowledge for certain, the subject, topics, and items of information that an employee or a student, this is for recruitment reasons, as a student or whoever wants to read the book should know. Skills, technical or manual proficiencies, which are usually learned or acquired through training. This is less visible in Gellius. Knowledge is visible everywhere. Skills, the training in skills, this is less perceptible, but I will try to show you that this is there as well. And there have been many interpretations that show it, that Gellius gives us exercises to do or homework to do he proposes his own translation, a Latin translation of a Greek text, and he leaves some space for us to create a similar, to write something similar, to make a similar exercise. So how to use, he shows us on his own example how to use sources, how to work with earlier books, how to, he gives us some reports about learned conversations. So for example, it takes a certain skill to take part in a conference like the one we are having now. And if somebody wants to learn it, of course, the best way is just to take part in this kind of activities. But if you don't have an opportunity to take part in a learned conference, then maybe you can read the proceedings. And this is what Gellius does. Some chapters seem like a report from a learned conversation that he had with his friends and with the teacher Favorinus and with other scholars. So this is also visible. And then abilities or attitudes, the demonstrable capacity to apply several knowledge, knowledge and skills simultaneously in order to complete a task. I prefer attitudes because this is this cupido for learning. He shares with us, Gellius, in many chapters, he shares with us his own enthusiasm for learning, for reading. I once thought also about this double perspective that he gives us, that the activities that we have as scholars, researchers, literary people, they can be divided into two groups. And tentatively, I try to call it the introverted scholarship and extroverted scholarship. So introverted would be reading, writing, working with texts alone in your office or in the library, and extroverted scholarly activities would be sharing things with other people like we're doing now, or even discussing it over a glass of beer with your friends, with your learned friends. So these two aspects are intertwined, and there is an interplay of these two aspects in the whole Attic Nights. So my idea is to read the Attic Nights as a handbook or as a workbook, maybe, a book of exercises. This is a nice perspective because it excludes the criticism that Gellius leaves some questions unanswered. We would never criticize an author of an exercise book that he left the blanks in some text, fill in the blanks. Of course, the blanks should be there because this is what the book is for. Or a manual or a guidebook, how to, especially keeping in mind the social perspective, the literary elite, how to get there, how to become part of it. He guides us, he takes us by hand, so to say, and he takes us together with him to all these learned people, to all these philosophical or literary banquets, he takes us with us to hear, to listen to a lecture by a certain philosopher. He takes us with us together to his own office, to his own library, and he shows us his own books. He shows us what he did with these books. He shows us how he, for example, translated a certain passage from a Greek author into Latin. And sometimes he also gives us some secret missions. For example, I will show you this in a second basing on several examples. We might not even notice at the first sight that this is an exercise, but it is when we study it more diligently. Or sometimes we don't know it because we don't have this ancient type of erudition. We only know about what is extant. We don't know we do not live, we are not imbued in this cultural milieu of the 2nd century AD. So this is my idea of how to read the Attic Nights, a friendly cicerone, a friendly Gellius, who guides us through this world of literature, both literature as books, writings, and literature as a community of people who are interested in it. And I would like to take a very quick look on book 3. This is a book that I studied more diligently 10 years ago when I was preparing my PhD. And not all chapters, but maybe 7 or 8 chapters, just treated as a random example, taken randomly from one of the books. And I will not read everything, but this is, and the slides, I don't know if you can see, the text might be small, but this is more for me to remember what I want to talk about. So the first chapter is one of these examples where we have a conversation between scholars. We are apud balneas titias in a certain bath, cum favorino philosopho, inter ambulandum legabatur Catilina salusti. And Favorinus, the philosopher, makes a remark about a certain passage, and he asks a question, and he says, non dum reperio. I don't understand really. He makes this point, and he says, this is not clear to me. I'm not really sure what it is about. And he asks the question to everybody, but then it is also said Favorinus me aspiciens. So there is Gellius as a person in this chapter, and he responds, et ego longe iam dio in eo ipse querendo fui. I've been wondering for a long time about this exact thing, and if you hadn't asked, I would have asked about this passage. And a discussion follows. We have several answers by the participants of this walk around the park in the baths, and none of these responses is satisfactory. And in the very end, Favorinus makes a conclusion that is not. It doesn't satisfy us. It doesn't give us a real response. And this chapter was subject to a lot of criticism because of that. Well, Gellius starts the topic, but actually never finishes his argument. There is not much that we can learn. He doesn't really answer the question. And we can read if we think that this is a manual or a guidebook, we can allow this interpretation that, well, this is for the reader to decide. Maybe you can find a different solution. Maybe you can decide which of the three proposed solutions you like most. Maybe you can add some more arguments. And first of all, this is how he describes, and he makes a report of how, he says, this is how such learned conversations are held. This is what you do. This is what you need to do if you want to join this intellectual literary community. So to me, when I read this, of course, the best way to become part of this intellectual community would be to join it and to start to experiment and to experience it on your own. But not everybody has the opportunity to do that, and in Galli's times as well. So I think that this is this can be seen as the goal of the Attic Nights, to give somebody a book instead of, for this person to read instead of a real life experience. It also brings to my mind the courses, online courses in certain topics. Maybe this could be a metaphor for the Attic Nights. Then chapter 2, a completely different style. This is a literary, a scholarly essay, a serious essay on a typical antiquarian subject, which is de temporibus terminisque dierum. This is about calendar, whether midnight should be the beginning of the new day, or morning, or maybe evening of the previous day. Many quotations from many learned authors, Varro, first of all. And to me, when I read it as a textbook, as handbook, this is an example, an exemplary way of dealing with such a subject. If you want to, well, first of all, this is a subject that can be of interest, and if you happen to deal with this subject, this is how you do it. So this is chapter 2 of book 3. Chapter 3 of book 3, a very popular, very successful chapter, De Noscendis Explantisque Plauti Comedis. Again, a very interesting thing, a typical literary history. So the topic is one of the most common in the Attic Nights. But for this chapter, I want to take a slightly different approach. If we think about a modern textbook or a modern book in general, the difference, we see the differences in typography. And I think that Gellius was a person who really, he would have made great use of modern typography, but well, he couldn't because it didn't yet exist. I tried to take a look at this chapter. It's quite a long chapter. This is the whole text. The title divides it in 2 parts. First, this is about assessing which comedies of Plautus are original and which ones aren't. And the second part is an anecdote, or 2 anecdotes actually, quod Plautus et Nevius in carcere fabulas scriptitarint. So 2 completely different subjects that seem to be, well, they are disconnected. And when you read it, this first part marked in yellow corresponds to these paragraphs, and the green part corresponds to the last part of the chapter. So this could fall into the category, Gellian scholars speak about it sometimes, a postscript. So Gellius added this anecdote, or these anecdotes, he added it during the second redaction of the work. I don't want to say anything more about this, because what interests me much more is this part that seemingly doesn't belong to either. And when I read this chapter very, very diligently, I thought that of course, the idea of a footnote makes sense, but it's not that this is a footnote, because this green part is already announced in the title. I don't want to get into more detail about whether the titles were written later or before. We have the wonderful work of Professor Holford Strevens that deals with it in detail. But the fact is that we have Gellius himself, when he read this chapter and when he wanted to give it a title, he thought that there are two main parts, the yellow one and the green one. So I wouldn't treat it as a postscript because this is announced in the title. But when we look at this part not marked in any color, it seems that there are 4 disconnected pieces of information. It doesn't make sense when you read it. It's not a continuous narrative. The narrative that makes logical sense ends here with the yellow part. And then we have 4 items of knowledge that are just added without any seeming visible order. So I started to analyze how these parts relate to the first part. And this is what I've discovered. They can be, these 4 items can be treated as footnotes. So it seems that Gellius, and you can see the colors here, he wanted to add something about, he mentioned Elius and Sedigitus and the other grammarians, and then he thought that he wants to add something about Elius. And this can be found here, as if he added it later. And then the title of a play by Plautus, Boiotia, or Boiotia, and then there is a quotation that also contains this title and some other works, a quotation from Varro. So this is what we would put in a footnote. And then fabule quaedicuntur ambigue. Nequetamen dubium est, the thing marked in blue. Fin iste que scripte applauto non videntur, et non videntur, et nomine eius adicuntur, veterum poetarum fuerint. So these are the ambigue. And the most interesting footnote for me is the one that I I refer it to the word plautinissimi, which is a neologism. In order to create such an adjective from the name of Plautus, you must know what is the correct form of his name. And so he creates this wonderful neologism, which is Plautin in itself, a self-reference. But then he gives us an additional piece of information, in eodem libro, Varronis, id quoque scriptum est. Et Plautium fuisse quempiam poetam comediarum. Quoniam fabula ille Plauti inscripta forent, acceptas esse quasi Plautinas, cum essent non applauto Plautines et applautio Plautiane. So an explanation of, well, this form is correct for sure, because otherwise they would be Plautianissimi. And I try to make a demonstration, an experiment, and I put this chapter in a modern, I try to edit it in a modern way. So we have book 3, chapter 3, part A, and then part B. I separated these 2 parts. And these footnotes are actually, they should be here between these 2 parts. They are here in Gellius, in the Attic Nights. But I added the marks here and put them in the footnote section. This is just an experiment for 1 chapter, but I plan to study it more for other chapters as well, because I can see that very often, it seems to me that very often the places where there has been this interpretation that Gellius is chaotic or doesn't make logical sense in his in what he's saying, very often this can be explained this way, that basically he didn't know the footnote and he couldn't do it in a graphical way, and now we can interpret it this way. My time is, I'm running out of time, so just maybe 2 or 3 slides more. The next 3 chapters, very short anecdotes, yes, anecdotes you can say. Seemingly, there is, these are just, they would belong in the K part, in the knowledge part of our framework, KSA framework. But if you read this more diligently, you can see that they are not just simple anecdotes. This is actually Gellius engaging in an interplay with some other author. In some cases we can trace the sources. In some other cases we cannot trace. We can just suspect that this has been taken from a certain author and edited or written by Gellius in this way and not another, because he wanted to engage in a certain literary game with the source that he's using. So of course, if we know the source, if the reader has already read the source before, which might be possible, then the reader should be able to understand the differences, to notice the differences, and to understand Gellius's purpose in these little anecdotes. But here the sources are not given, they are just mentioned. They are not quoted, they are just the names of the authors are mentioned. But then the following two chapters, which are longer, 7 and 8, they are much longer. And here we have a similar situation, but the source is actually quoted. It's given to us. So it seems like these three chapters, 4, 5, and 6, this is a more difficult exercise because you need to remember, you need to know yourself where this anecdote might have been taken from. But here, in case you didn't get it, here you have a simpler and easier exercise because he already gives us, this is about the very famous story about the military tribune, the Roman equivalent of Thermopylae. And there is a narrative of this story, of the beginning of the story, by Gellius, who tries to imitate the Republican Latin, Republican writing. And then at the end, he gives a direct quotation from Cato. So you can compare, you can see, did he do it well or not? How good is his Republican Latin? How well can he imitate Cato? And we have the source given very straightforwardly. And then another chapter, the next chapter, there is another type of source, a letter. We've discussed letters today a lot also. A letter, and a very ancient letter from Fabricius to the Senate, and also a way of Gellius, a way of him showing us how we can deal with this kind of historical source. And one last thing, Gellius is a philologist, so his attention to detail is very great and to particular words. And here we have a chapter that is a test. This is, to me, this looks like a test, an exam for the student. So there is a story about a certain horse, and the horse had a particular color, which is called spadix. And Gellius says, colore peniceo erat equus. But in the title, he says spadix. This is the Greek equivalent of this color. I'm not a specialist in the colors of horses, so I'll not try to translate it into English. But then we are in chapter 3.9. And if you are a good student, you will remember that in chapter 226, so 15 chapters earlier, this was an entire paragraph, a very famous chapter as well, about the Latin and Greek names of colors. And this word spadix was explained in a detailed way, and the history behind the word. So if you read this, you can know that, well, you've read Gellius diligently, and you paid attention because you know much more about this particular rare word. One last example, bibosus, chapter 12, bibosus. This is a counterexample. This chapter is an explanation of the morphology of a certain group of words. And then if you go to book 4, you will have some more quotations, vinosus, mulierosus, religiosus. And then if you have read this chapter 3.12 and paid attention, then in chapter 4.9, you will be able to explain these words. so much from me. Thank you for your patience, and I will be very, very happy to hear all of your comments and remarks and questions.
Katarzyna, thank you very much indeed. That was really, can I just say how wonderful it was to hear Latin read so in such a way as to induce comprehension in the reader, which is a remarkable skill. It has to be said. Thank you for that. We have a question from Torsten. So over to you, Torsten.
Yes, thank you, Roy, and thank you very much, Katarzyna, for this paper. I actually have several questions, but I'll try to limit myself to a couple of things. You have given us a couple of technical terms which might capture the nature of the Attic Nights. You were talking about a handbook, a guidebook, an exercise book. I think to some extent this would be supported by what Gellius says at the very end of his preface, namely that summaries of the material to be found in each book of my commentaries I have here placed all together in order that they may be at once clear what is to be sought and found in every book. So this is pretty much a strategy that we also find in Pliny the Elder's long preface to the Natural History, with which Gellius's preface shares quite a few characteristics. I wonder what might be gained from a more or less direct comparison with similar works that we could subsume under the heading of miscellany writings. So, for example, Macrobius's Saturnalia or Athenaius's Deipnosophists. Is that something you've taken into account? I mean, they are not exactly the same category, but I think you would actually gain quite a few things from a comparison with similar works. I mean, you could also take into account Aelian's De Natura Animalium, or the Varia, the histories of the same author, again, of a slightly different nature, but I think they belong to a similar group of texts.
Two questions, if I understand correctly. I'll start with the last one. I myself, I'm a homo unius libri, so I'm a fan of Gellius, and all the other authors are ahead of me. Of course, I read them as well, but I believe that there are other scholars who do a great job in studying and in comparing different authors. Of course, there's Plutarch, the entire collection of Plutarch, which can be treated as a whole. And as a whole, it is somehow similar to the Attic Nights. There is Aelian, there is the Deipnosophistae, as you said. Professor Bartol, the author of the article that I mentioned, she actually proposes the name poikilography based on several works, not only Gellius. So there has been a lot of research about this. And well, this generic affiliation of the Attic Nights, it's too bad that all these books, most of these books are lost. Gellius gives, I don't know, 40 or 50 titles in his preface, and we don't have, we just have several. So, well, this is a big subject. I've studied that a little bit, but as I said, I'm not competent enough to read these other books myself as diligently as I want to read Gellius. So I will pass on this one, and I prefer to read the results of scholarship that others have done. But of course, you're perfectly right. This is fascinating to compare them to the preface of Pliny. It's this is very interesting because since this is another subject, a digression maybe, that is very, it seems very fascinating to me. What we have at the beginning of, we know that the beginning of the preface of Gellius is lost. Yeah. And we know that Pliny dedicates his work to the emperor. And there has been this idea that maybe Gellius also dedicated the Attic Nights to the emperor. This sounds very convincing to me, considering how the emperor, the person of the emperor gets, when you read the Attic Nights from cover to cover, from the beginning to the end, the the person of the emperor becomes closer and closer and closer. There are certain moments where you first there is a person of a certain senator, then another, like someone who's closer to the imperial court, Favorinus, who was friends with who was very well known, and Fronto, who was the teacher of the sons of the emperor. And then the last chapter, when the name of the emperor is mentioned, is when Gellius is together with someone who is waiting for an audience with the emperor. And then the end of the last book is lost. We don't have, we don't have maybe 7 to 10 to 12 chapters are missing. So I'm so curious if Gellius actually made it to the emperor, to his own audience with the emperor. So and this comparison is something that we can make with Pliny and with his preface, because we know that Naturalis Historia was dedicated to the emperor. So one little detail that can be compared, but of course, well, this is such a huge subject. Yeah, I prefer to read books about this than write my own. And then another, the first question you asked was, and I will show my screen, I will share my screen again. You mentioned this passage. I hope you can see, no, you can't see it now. You should be able to see it. You mentioned this passage. This is the very end of the preface. Volumina commentariorum.
Exactly.
Yes, ad hunc diem viginti iam facta sunt. This is something that I actually wanted to mention. This wasn't a question to the previous talk, that's why I didn't ask it. But there was a discussion about whether the collection was composed as a whole or not. So here for Gellius, we don't have any doubts, because he says it himself, that volumina commentariorum ad hunc diem viginti iam facta sunt. So we have 20 books, and the author wants to publish these 20 books as a whole. But please take a look at what he says later. Progredietur ergo numeros librorum, diis bene juvantibus, cum ipsius vitae quantum quamque fuerit progressibus. So if I have the luck to live longer, I will continue. So he envisaged that he could write the Attic Nights Volume 2. And don't you do it with a textbook? Of course, with a handbook, a manual, part 1 and part 2. And if you write part 2 after 10 years, this doesn't mean that this is separate. Of course, this is connected with part 1. I hope this answers somehow your question.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm just slightly conscious of the time here, so but I very much enjoyed your demonstration of footnotes. that was excellent. So it was quite inspiring. So we just remains us to thank Katarzyna again, and we'll take a 13-minute break till 40 minutes past the hour, when we'll come back for Justine Wolfenden's paper on Aprilis's Florida. So thank you very much again, Katarzyna.